Okay, hello, welcome to Matter Over Mind. My name is Stephen, I'm a business psychologist, and with me, as always, we have...
Thomas, me, the experimental physicist of the duo. How are you doing?
Very good, good to have you back again. So, it won't mean much to you as a listener, but to us, this is the second recording in 2 days, so we're really going for it this week. And you're quite busy at the moment. You're preparing or just about to prepare for your big experiment for your PhD. So
yes, indeed.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I've been designing this thing for the last year and a half, so hopefully it goes well. It's over 2 weeks. So yeah, exciting times. I've been waiting a while to do this.
Very good.
Should be good.
Yeah. Brilliant. So we want to talk about your research coming up shortly. So we've got for this first season we're going to have 12 episodes. That's the plan anyway, isn't it? And so we've got sort of 4 left to record after this one. So we're planning to record one that is talking about your research. So that'll be great. We can catch up with you after you've done the experiment. Obviously there'll be a long way to go. You'll have to do all the data crunching, but at least you can tell us how it went.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds good. I always like talking about my research, so that's always good.
Cool, brilliant. Okay, great. So what are we talking about today then, Thomas?
Today we're talking about the self, which you teased at the end of last week's episode, or the other week's episode, that you have the answer. You know what the self truly is outside of the character traits and all this other stuff.
That's right.
You know that you know the truth. So what is
the truth?
What is the self, Stephen?
Well, the truth will set you free, as someone once said. Okay. So it probably seems like we've talked about nothing but self on the psychology part of this podcast. But when you think about it, what is psychology really, if not about this self thing? But I think what I would like to do with this episode is to kind of bring together all the different things that we've talked about and try to make sense out of a lot of the different ways that we talk about this concept of self. We've discussed already things like consciousness. In our very first episode, we talked about behavior and sort of psychometrics and psychological profiles and stuff last time. And it's all kind of quite complicated, and so it'd be nice if we could get some clarity here. And I do think that we can actually say what we mean now by the term self if we're very careful. And the problem is that we're not careful enough when we talk about self. So you've asked me a question. You said put your money where your mouth is, Stephen. What is self? So I'm going to read a little quote that really sets up where I am on this.
Okay.
And it's related to something called narrative identity, which I'll explain in a minute. But a leading researcher in this area is called Kate McLean, and she's done quite a lot of work on this, and one of her papers has this brilliant sentence. It kind of encapsulates everything for me. And she says, narrative identity builds slowly over time as people tell stories about their experiences to and with others.
Okay. Over
developmental time, selves create stories, which in turn create selves. And it's that last little sentence there that I think is absolutely brilliant. Over developmental time, selves create stories, which in turn create selves.
Okay. So is that like when you kind of, the more times you tell a story, the more certain you are that it's true? That's the sort of idea?
Well, obviously that is part of it. So if we just sort of keep that in our head for a minute, I think it's worth thinking about the probably 3 or 4 different aspects of this topic that some of which we've already talked about quite a bit. But if I could try to just go back on some of those, then I think that'll hopefully start to make sense. So in the very first psychology part of the dyad, the very first episode on psychology, we were looking at consciousness and in particular AI. We listened to that interview with Jeffrey Hinton, all about whether AI is conscious and so on. And so we got into this question of consciousness. And he was also talking about this subjective sense of self, or this subjective self. Mm-hmm. This subjective experience that I exist. It's that thing that Descartes said when he said, I think, therefore I am. It's this thing that we have inside us that makes us believe that we're alive and that we know we're alive. And he talked about that. We discussed that on our podcast. So that's one thing. So think about that as a single thing. That we have this subjective sense of self, and that's one aspect of us.
Okay.
And when we discussed all of that, I fairly briefly talked about this attention schema theory, which I think is a really good scientific way of describing this sense of self. Do you remember what that was?
So there's you've got your schema of an apple. You've got your rough representation of what an apple is, what it looks like, and then you've got the schema of the amount of attention you're given to that thing, right?
Yeah, that's it pretty much. I mean, it's the attention schema is the model of the attention that you give to you perceiving that thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Does that make sense? So we have schemas for everything. We have models for everything. Our brain does these schemas, these sort of cartoon versions of reality, mm-hmm. because it would take too much processing power to understand everything in detail. So it just sketches out these schemas, these models of reality, and we use that. That's our kind of they're our kind of working models of everything. For instance, we have a working model of our body. We have a schema of our body. We don't know all the ins and outs of it, but we have a decent approximation of it, which means we don't keep banging into doors. You know, we know roughly how long our limbs are and how long our legs are and all of that. Mm-hmm. So we have this schema of our body. It's called a body schema, but it's a very cartoonish version of it. It's a very simplified version of it. And the mind does that for everything. It's got schemas for everything. Schemas for work, schemas for play, schemas for relationships. But it also has schemas for its own processing. And so when it comes to this process of attention, we have a schema for that. So we have a process around attention that says, oh, I'm looking at this right now and I'm giving this attention. But we've got this other schema, this other thing that's looking at that, saying, oh, look, I'm looking at that thing.
Okay. I think I understand a bit better. Yeah.
So kind of like a second, it's like once removed from the actual processing that we're doing, it's us looking at the schema going, oh, that's what's happening now. And that, there's nothing magical about that, but that process that's happening fools us into thinking that we have this kind of ethereal consciousness. And that's how we describe it. We describe it as consciousness. But in reality, I think that's a bad word to use. I think it's better to stick with this simpler version, which is this subjective experience. So that's one thing that we have. That is a part of it's a very, very important part of what makes us what we are, but it is only a part of it. So let's put that on the shelf for a minute. So we've got that one. It's called the subjective experience. This what feels magical, but it's actually a kind of trick of the brain that is a physical thing that's going on. Mm-hmm. But that's the subjective experience. So then we've got this other thing called consciousness, which the two of those often get sort of mixed up with. Okay. But I would say they're similar and there's some overlap, like there is with all of these things, but it's not the same. So, like, I can think of some animals, for instance, or some creatures that are, I think you would describe them as conscious, but I'm not sure that they would have, I mean, we don't know this for sure. This is a very difficult thing to prove, if not impossible, but I think we might anticipate, or I think we logically could assume that like a worm doesn't have a sense of self. I don't think a worm is having a subjective experience of being a worm.
Okay.
But it is conscious.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah.
So we've got this subjective experience that makes us feel like we have this ethereal part of us, this mysterious thing. We used to call it a soul. Some people still do. And it feels like that's kind of the thing that's driving the bus, that sort of magical thing inside us, which is what, where dualism came from. This is why Descartes was a dualist, because he thought there was this inner thing, this soul, and then we had this other mechanical stuff.
Okay.
So I don't think worms have that. I mean, we don't know for sure, but I think it's a pretty good chance that they don't have that. But I think you describe them as conscious because they, we can describe people as conscious or not conscious. For instance, when you go into have an operation, you have an anaesthetic, you lose consciousness. So I think you could imagine a worm being like that, if you like. I mean, this is quite speculative, but that's what I think. I think that bit is the most difficult to prove, and I'm happy to be challenged on that one. Self-awareness and consciousness, can we pass those? I think we can, but okay, maybe not.
Yeah, that's
okay. Then we've got. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, that makes sense to me in terms of, because so you've probably seen videos out there where there's like a bit of meat and it's raw, and you can see the fibers kind of twitching because it's just a leftover nervous response of the bit of meat. So that is because I was just thinking how I could counter the point of the worm, thinking, well, it could just be on autopilot. But there's a difference between a worm kind of deciding what it's doing in some rudimentary way versus the random spasms of a bit of meat because it has some leftover potential in its nerves or something. So I guess it's conscious because it kind of has to be. Otherwise, it's just random motions, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it requires. There's got to be some mental processing going on for us to say something is conscious. But I would suggest that there is a. I mean, you could say, I'm going to argue against myself now. You could say that like if you chop a worm in half, for instance, by accident with your spade, when you're digging your garden. So I'm not saying we should be cruel to worms, but they do demonstrate a reaction to that. They sort of writhes around. Now, is that having a subjective experience? I think there has to be a subject for you to say it's subjective, and so I'm not sure. I think it requires this sense of being able to be aware of the experience for us to say that it has a subjective experience. Okay. So it may react to that, it might respond to that, and that's what makes it conscious. But I don't think it has a subjective experience because it doesn't have this subject versus object kind of relationship. This is very difficult. This is I'm not sure I'm right about that, let's be honest. But I think you could argue that these two are similar, but not exactly the same thing. Anyway, it doesn't actually matter that much for my argument, but just trying to dot I's and cross T's. Yeah. So, and then we come to intelligence, which we haven't really discussed that, but that is often used. I mean, we did talk about artificial intelligence. So for me, that's another thing again. So I think something could be intelligent without being conscious or have any subjective experiences.
Okay.
And I would argue that computers are like that.
Okay. So how would you define intelligence? Because this is something I've kind of wondered for a while now. If someone is intelligent versus someone who's experienced, they might in principle know the same stuff, but what's the distinction, I guess? What is intelligence?
Yeah, I think that type of intelligence is something slightly different. That's you're talking there about sort of levels of we may measure that in something like IQ, but it's I think we're talking about the question of whether something actually has any intelligence or not.
Right,
so
okay.
the binary question is, like I may not be as intelligent as you, but I think you would accept that I do have some intelligence.
Fair point. Okay.
Yeah, you're going to give me that. Okay, good. So yeah, I think what the question here is whether whether a artificial intelligence is actually intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
Is it intelligent or is it not? And I think even something if you define that as being able to make decisions
mm-hmm.
based on its environment and trying to achieve some goal, then I think you could say that machines have been intelligent for quite a long time. Chess playing machines, those sorts of things, are able to make decisions,
mm-hmm.
and they are able to beat the best chess players in the world. So they are intelligent in a very narrow sense,
mm-hmm.
in that they can make decisions, they can achieve goals, not their own goals though, but still goals that are given to them. So again, this is a sort of more a philosophical question in a way, but intelligence is not really. You don't have to have consciousness or subjective experience to experience intelligence. That is one of the risks of artificial intelligence, is that because it doesn't have, as far as we know, any subjective experience, it cannot understand the damage it might do.
Mm.
It could wipe out a whole civilization. It would have no understanding that was a problem, so long as it was achieving its goals. So I think you could imagine a being highly intelligent, super intelligence that had no awareness of self or no consciousness as such in the way that we understand it, or subjective experience, whether you count those two as the same or different. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Because, like you say, a chess computer you may call intelligent, because, like you say, it's making decisions. Do you need perception? Do you need to perceive to have intelligence? Because you could argue something's intelligence when they can perceive things very quickly, or understand what's happening.
Well, I was actually on another podcast. Might as well mention this now. By the time this gets released, it might be out there. A friend of mine called Spencer, he has a podcast called Truth Unrestricted. So if you want to catch that, then by all means catch that episode. But we talked about this there. So in my Physics for You book, which I keep referring to, you might be able to see it on my bookshelf behind me, Thomas. So in my Physics for You book, I remember the bit that we did about thermostats. I don't know why I remember this, but I've always remembered it because it seems so cool to me. And a basic thermostat, they probably don't make them like this anymore, but they used to make them out of bimetallic strips.
Okay.
And a bimetallic strip is just a strip with one bit of metal on one side and a different sort of metal on the other side. Mm-hmm. So if you imagine one strip of metal, or it looks like one strip, but it's actually two strips glued together. And one of those strips of metal reacts to heat or expands when it's heated up quicker than the other. Mm-hmm. So what that means is that it bends as it gets warmer. And as it bends, it then completes an electric circuit which switches the heater on or the light on or whatever the thing is. A thermostat, it would be heat, wouldn't it? So that's what's happening. Now, if you think about a thermostat, mm-hmm. if we think that intelligence is that it has perception, it can respond to outside stimuli, it then makes a decision, if you like, or it does something based upon the outside environment that it's perceived through this temperature change, then it's the very simplest. A thermostat is the very simplest form of intelligence, and then you just build on from there. So I'm prepared to accept, if we think about most of these things on a scale, then I think a thermostat is the very beginning of that scale of intelligence, just like a worm is very close to the beginning of consciousness. It's got a bit of it, but not very much.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, or it's like when you see when people make like calculators out of like water buckets. I don't know if you've seen those, when it's just simple logic gates, and then they get normally a binary number at the end, and then they can work out what that means. Which I guess, you'd say that's pretty smart. So I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, and if you think about the human body, that's not a lot different to what the human body does. There's receptors on the skin. Those receptors respond to changes in temperature, for instance. Those signals get passed to the brain. So obviously, it's much, much more complex, but essentially what's happening is outside stimuli, there's some response to that, either through mechanical devices or change like the bimetallic strip, or electrical or chemical electrical, whatever. These are their mechanisms that move on from there. But there's a sort of rudimentary intelligence there that I think you can describe computers as being intelligent, and they increase in their intelligence, their ability to use data from different sorts and synthesize that data and make use of it in lots of different ways. How can that not be intelligence? But it doesn't necessarily mean it's conscious, and I suggest that it isn't yet.
Okay, yeah, you've convinced me.
Okay, you're with me. Good. All right, so just thinking about where we're up to. So we've covered subjective sense of self, we've covered consciousness, we've covered intelligence. So the next two are very much connected, and I think, well, they're not the same, but they overlap a lot. And that is this idea of identity, and then this, what William James called the empirical self. So I want to talk about identity and what William James called the empirical self. He described that as the events and experiences that the pure ego knows. Okay. So I want to talk about the empirical self and identity. So just thinking about identity, what do you think, or from your perspective, what does that mean? What does it mean when we talk about identity? Identity is a big word these days. Everybody's talking about identity politics and stuff. Yeah. What do we mean by identity?
So is this just, I guess, how I show myself to the world, / also how I think I am perceived by the world, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Something.
That's a good way of putting it, I think. Yeah. If I was to say that you had multiple identities, would that bother you?
Well, it depends. You're either meaning like every now and again I come to your house as James, then maybe there's a bit of a different issue going on. But I guess different identities, I suppose how I behave at work versus at home are quite different. I have my professional self, and then I have my, I suppose, my normal self. The thing, So I suppose that, I have a few hats that I put on dependent on what I'm doing.
Yeah, so I think identity, for me, the best way, and again, we've done lots of research on identity, and there's lots of different ways of thinking about it, but I think we've kind of we've looked at it from lots of different angles, and we now can consolidate it quite well. So the big two, or I suppose three ways of thinking about identity is, first of all, is a very personal thing, which makes it almost the same as the self. But I think we need to pass those two. They're not the same thing, but they are similar, and they do overlap. Mm-hmm. And one of identity has a big impact on our sense of self, but it's not the same thing. But that is one school of thought, that essentially self and identity are one and the same.
Okay.
Another school of thought is that the social identity theory. So this is Henri Tajfeld's social identity theory. This is very influential. This helps us to understand in-groups and out-groups and why we tend to favour in-groups even when there's very little difference between the two. So we have this social identity. So for him, social identity, our identities are basically created through our social interactions. Like we discussed that young woman who was raised by dogs. I think we talked about, you asked me a great question, which was, would she have a sort of sense of self, or would she have an ego or a super ego when we talk about Freud? And yeah, there are questions about if you were literally raised without ever having any contact with people at all, or maybe you just, I don't know, in some theoretical scenario where you were raised by a robot, let's say. Science fiction film or science fiction series called Raised by Wolves explores that. It's a really interesting series, by the way. But if that was to happen and they weren't even mimicking people, then the question is, would you have a clear identity? If you've got no one else to compare yourself to, no one else to be part of a group or a social group, do you have an identity? So that the extreme version of that is no, you have to have a social world to have an identity. Okay. That's possible. But then you get Bandura, who kind of brings it all together, I think, and says, it's all you have to count it all in. There's our own identities and how we make sense of those, and our own concepts of ourselves, and what we think we know about ourselves. There's the way that our parents talk about us, and then there's the social world that we meet at school and at work and all of that. And Erickson as well, another person really interested in how we develop our sense of self. So I think that's kind of the most modern way of thinking about identity in particular, but also that we have multiple identities. So we are able to cope with multiple identities. So, I'm a dad. I definitely see myself as a dad. If somebody said to me, are you a dad? I would say, yes, I am a father. I am a dad. And that's part of my identity, or that's one of my identities. But yeah, then I go to work and I'm a consultant, I'm a trainer, I'm a coach. You're an academic. I also see myself as a psychologist. You see yourself as a physicist. These are identities. I'm a husband. You're soon to be a husband. These are identities that we have, and we quite happily accept that we have these different identities. And yeah, that does affect our behaviour when we put these different sort of identities on. So I think we're cool with having multiple identities. But although we might interchange the word identity with selves, if I was to say your true self,
okay,
would you be comfortable thinking that you had multiple core selves, or multiple core or true selves?
See, it's actually something I think about from time to time. I suppose this kind of also leads into the question that I asked with the girl raised by the animals, or raised with the animals. Sorry, is if suppose right now I teleported to a different planet, or as the only person on that planet, how quickly would I devolve to basically just an ape? I think about that sometimes. I think would I hold on? Would I still do the things I do? Would I make my rock bed on the rock planet, and would I clean the rock dishes and whatever else? Would I care?
Yeah.
How long would it take before I just went full feral, I guess would be the correct word. Or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe like in Castaway, Tom Hanks chats to his friend, the volleyball, and he's relatively sane.
So why does he have Wilson there? Why does he talk to his imaginary friend?
Well, I guess it's to have some sense of normalcy to his strange life. And I guess also there's the hope that he is eventually going to get back home, right? So I suppose maybe there's that. Maybe because he's holding on to the fact that he probably has, well, in his mind, he would like to return home, so he can't lose touch completely. I'm guessing that's probably why, right?
Yeah, and I think it actually is. It suggests the social identity theory is really very important. You know, that actually he doesn't have anybody else, so he has to create somebody. You know, and I think that would probably happen. You know, again, we have lots of fiction around this type of thing, and normally you find that people in those situations, again, these are just people's writings, so these are not scientific experiments, but I think authors and creators generally appreciate that if you were in those situations, you'd start imagining you were talking to people, you'd have imaginary conversations, you might talk to yourself as if you were talking to somebody else. And in, you know, Castaway, it's a ball, you know, that he makes to look like a person, and he has those interactions because we need them. That's part of being a human. So that's the bit I want to get to today, is this self, and it's often called the narrative self or narrative identity. And this is where I come back to Kate McLean's definition. So if you can, I'll just remind you what that was. Over developmental time, cells create stories, which in turn create selves. So for me, the self bit, so I'm not here getting confused about subjective experience, because we've already handled that one, and that's really important. And we know consciousness is part of the picture. We accept that. And intelligence, yes, okay. But this is the final piece of that puzzle, which is that we have a way of describing ourselves. We have a way of talking about ourselves. And we imbue onto this creature that I called Stephen certain characteristics. But I don't just accept the characteristics. I also have to tell a story about them.
Okay.
And the story explains those characteristics.
Okay.
And so we tell stories about ourselves to ourselves and to other people. And I think it's that is the self. It's the stories that we tell about ourselves, to ourselves, and to other people. That's the self. That's the narrative self. That's the self that William James is talking about, the empirical self. And this is rooted in memory. So we can talk about memory in a minute. But if we're talking about a kind of physical mechanism, then you have to get into memory. But if, you know, in practical terms, what it means is that if we're talking about the self, we're really talking about stories.
Okay. Interesting.
Thoughts?
So, I suppose now's as good a point as I need to mention, but I've been reading 1984.
Okay.
So this kind of, it's not quite the same thing, but obviously for those who have read the book or seen the movie, you know, it's set in, for the time, the future, where there's this oppressive regime where you kind of have to follow the party rules, or the party. And yeah, everyone's kind of homogenized. That's kind of the point, right? And what they do what the main character's job is, he works in the department of truth in the media department, and basically they go back and kind of fudge the past documents of stuff. So they'll go to old newspapers and rewrite the articles to make, you know, the current people in power seem like they were right all along, or whatever. So I guess it kind of goes back to that, the memory thing. Once history begins to get messed with or erased, then everyone just kind of, there's no self anymore. And that's, I guess, kind of the point of the book, right? Everyone's trying to be controlled. So erase the past. They don't have a sense of self anymore because you can't piece anything together anymore because it's all just yeah.
That's brilliant. I mean, you're absolutely spot on to bring that up because that is absolutely at the core of that story. By the way, before we go on, you must tell your John Hurt story.
Oh yeah. So 8 years ago now, before I delved down the physics rabbit hole, I was a waiter at a hotel, and one night this guy and his wife come in. It's an elderly gentleman, and he looks really familiar. I feel like I know this guy, but I couldn't quite pin it. So, me and my colleague chat about it a bit, and we couldn't work it out. We thought maybe it's John Hurt. I don't know. So we go to reception, and we're like, that couple that just came in. What's their name on the system? And it was the lady's name. So they didn't sign in under the gentleman's name. So we're like, oh, well, that's a bit suspect that. But yeah, it was John Hurt. I guess he was doing a show or something close by. So yeah, I got his autograph. So I've still got that slip of paper somewhere. From a little waiter notepad. I tore it off and he signed a thing for me. So that's cool, yeah.
Cool.
About John Hurt.
That's very good. I mentioned that obviously because John Hurt was starred in the 1984 I think that's the most well-known film about adaptation from the book. Yeah, so it's really cool. Yeah. Okay, so going back to our topic though, yeah, that's right. And let's take some of those bits. So what that I think does demonstrate is that if you think on a social level, so this is a totalitarian government that is being imagined here. And so you can imagine that individuals have to tell the same story. They have to tell a story that involves the party and the benefits of the party and how life is perfect now that they have the party telling them what to do. And their individual parts that they play, the story that they tell is all about their role in helping the party and helping the party to give people better lives. So, okay, he works in the Department of Truth, therefore his activity is there to help him, to help the party to deliver its goals. And everybody's story will be a variance on that. So what we see in totalitarian governments and in cults and high control relationships is that the people in power try to reduce the opportunities for people to tell different stories, their own stories. They all have to tell the same story or variances of it, at least have very lots of similarities between stories. Whereas in societies where you don't get that, you have lots of different stories, competing stories, and that's sometimes chaotic and gives rise to conflict. But that's because people have different stories, and that's part of their natural process. But in these sorts of environments, yeah, absolutely. The memory thing is very important. So collective memory in this world that Orwell created, of course, it was still newspapers that they had to correct. So the old-fashioned media. And so they were changing the way that society remembered about the past. And again, that has a parallel for us as well. So we create stories based upon our memories. So we have something called episodic memory and we have semantic memory. So episodic memory are the things that we remember that's happened to us. So I remember my first day at school. I'm sure you remember your first day at your job or when you first met Celine, those sorts of things. Those are episodes in your life. And then you have a semantic memory, which is how that fits into your world. So again, we could describe it as a story that you then explain how that fits into your experience and how that makes sense to you. And if you think about the stories we tell about ourselves, in a way, we're trying to create a story that makes us make sense.
Okay.
So all the things that we do in our lives, we remember some of them, and they're the only ones actually that can go towards this story. So only those ones we remember can contribute to this story that we tell about ourselves. So I was always very diligent at school. I always wanted to learn. I was well behaved, and that was sort of the way I was up until I grew up. And then the story could go, but at that point I rebelled and I wanted to do something different, or it could be, and that's the way I carried on, and I carried on doing this and that, and so on. So there's all sorts of different types of narratives, and some of the research on this is really interesting because people have different sorts of narratives, different sorts of stories. You have the kind of stories where there's been something bad that's happened to us, and we have a way of talking about that story that shows that we had this bad thing that happened, but we're able to get over it. And it's almost like a heroic sort of story. And that's a particular type of story. Then there's other stories that are about we had bad things happen to us, and we are still suffering because of that. So the way that we interpret and make sense of events in our lives can have a big part on the story we tell about ourselves, and how we see ourselves.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
So there's lots of different types of disciplines that sort of think in these terms. And so, I did some research around how people use stories to make sense of leaving a high control group or a cult. I've talked about this on other podcasts, so some of our listeners will know about this. And what I found in that research was that people found things like education or career as a way to kind of move their story on. So they'd left this high control situation where they were told what to think and what to do, a bit like 1984, the film you're watching. And they'd made a break with that. And that's like a massive shock to your sense of self. Your story's now, it's almost like when you're watching an old movie and one of the reels on the old-fashioned cinema projectors suddenly broken and it all stops. And that's what it's like if you leave a big situation like that. Or it could be the death of a loved one or of a partner. Or some of the research I read about was Marines in the States who had a terrible injury, which meant they could no longer be Marines. Another paper was middle-aged men who had lost their jobs during the big financial crisis, and they were in their 50s, and they were kind of their identity was all tied up with this job that they had, and all of a sudden they were. So again, their story was now, big events, if you like, that happened to them. But then the mission at hand was how they could carry on telling their story. And so they had to then explain either how they managed to cope with that because of their characteristics. So, I've always been able to be adaptable, or my dad told me how important it was never to forget that X, Y, Z, or, my mum used to always encourage me to do ABC, and they'd use those stories as a way to build a bridge onto the next part of their lives. But other people would tell stories that when, I've always wanted to be a Marine, it's me, it's who I am, and I can't do anything else. There's nothing else that is important to me. And those people suffered with more mental health problems because they were not able to tell their story. So I think for me, the self is a ongoing activity that we are undergoing every moment, which is to construct and reconstruct, build and rebuild a story that is us. We tell it to ourselves, we tell it to each other, and that is who we are, and that is our sense of self. Now, if you then couple that with self-awareness, with subjective experience, with consciousness, with personality traits, with intelligence. I think that's it.
Okay.
We've got it.
Yeah.
It's all there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I could. Yeah. And then, and sort of like you said before, there is overlap between some of these. I guess in isolation, these things are almost too abstracted from anything that you may call conscious or whatever. But no, that makes sense. That's a pretty nice picture, because it's a small handful of things that are reasonably well defined. Yeah, I like that.
Now, obviously, what it doesn't do, it doesn't get into the mechanical processes. So how all of the chemical, electrical signals in the grey matter gives rise to all of that is perhaps a different question. I think that's where people like Anil Seth are helping us, because he's interested in perception, and like we talked about on our first episode, things like why we have optical illusions and how the eyes work and how that translates into images that we conjure up in our mind, and how we actually lay down episodic memories, and how we then go back to them. I mean, these days we think that we can't think of these memories as like a hard drive that has something encoded onto it. They're much more fluid than that, and every time we remember it, we kind of have to reconstruct it again. So it's a lot less like a hard drive, and it's a lot more fluid than that, which is why memories can be faulty. Just one other thing to say about memory and its importance to our sense of self is one of the few ways we get insights into some of this stuff is to work with unfortunate people who have had brain injuries. And there's a particular case. His name is Waring. Second name is Waring. What was his first name? Clive Waring. And he was a musician. He was a conductor and a composer, brilliant musician, and he contracted encephalitis, sort of herpes viral version of it, and it basically affected his memory so that he couldn't lay down new memories.
Right. Okay.
So he could remember the past. But he couldn't he could experience things in a sort of 20-minute, half an hour setting. And so if you went to meet him, he'd say hello to you, and you'd tell him your name, and he'd be able to remember your name for the period of that conversation.
Yeah.
But if you went to see him tomorrow, he wouldn't know who you were, because he was unable to lay down new memories.
Okay, so you basically stopped mentally aging at 40 or however old they were when.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you think about this, and again, we're going to talk about Severance, the Apple TV show, which I can't stop talking about. I'll talk about it on every podcast I go on. You got to watch it, folks. But this has some relationship to that, actually. But if you think about what that means for his sense of self, it's terrifying. So his wife would come in to visit him. He'd been married many years. His wife would come in to visit him, and he'd see her. She'd come into the room. He'd see her, and you can watch this actually on YouTube. I'll put the link on the show notes, as long as it's not too distressing for you. But he would, as soon as he see her, he would throw his arms around her, and he would say, "Oh, thank goodness, it's been terrible. It's been like being dead. Finally, it's over. I don't. What's happened? I've been unconscious all this time. I don't know what's happened. It's been like being dead." And for him, it was as if he'd been in a coma all this time. He couldn't remember anything. So he'd look at himself in the mirror and he'd like couldn't understand how he'd aged. He didn't understand why his wife was aging. So of course his story had stopped, literally had stopped at that point.
Yeah.
And his sense of self was there, fixed in time. He would never grow as a person. He would never change as a person. He would never develop as a person. He was there. That's where he was. Yeah, so that demonstrates the importance of memory to our sense of self. But it's that mechanism, and then we tell a story that changes it from episodic memory into this sense-making activity, making it into something, the semantic memory that is, right, this actually means this. Mm-hmm. This person was important to me. This experience meant this to me. It formed me in this way. It formed me in that way. This experience made me think differently about that. And that's the story we tell, which is partly why stories are so important to us as a species. I can't think of anything else that is more important to us as a species than stories.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay,
there we go.
I like
that.
That's it. Self done. Yeah, so I mean, obviously it's a lot to understand. There's lots of the mechanics there still to understand, but I think the theoretical structure is that it's all there. What we need to do is be a bit more careful about the way we describe these things, and I think researchers and psychologists need to. This is never going to happen, by the way, but it'd be great if we could all talk about things and have the same definitions for them.
That's. I'd say one of the nice things about physics. Obviously, there's a bit of slip, but generally. Velocity means velocity, and it's got a distinct definition, and there's no ambiguity on what that means. Some of the phrases or the terminology might be a little bit different, but in general, the maths and the physics are fairly consistent. If that means this, everyone, plus minus some error, some standard deviation. That's
right, and this is the problem. One of our listeners, Vincent, he said. I find the although physics and quantum physics is quite difficult, I seem to find that easier to get my head around than the psychology ones. And I mean that's because I think we understand more about the physics of the universe than we do our minds, really. So and this relates to ontology and epistemology. That maybe we talk about that another time.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Cool. All right. Well, I've enjoyed that anyway.
Thanks.
I think that was interesting.
Yeah, learned a lot.
Give us something to ponder on.
Yeah, nice one.
Very good. Okay. Well, have a good luck for your research. The next time we record, I think you'll have done it, so you can tell us, or at least done the actual experiment. So hopefully. It goes well. Fingers crossed.
Yeah,
good luck with that.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe or follow whatever app you're using. We do a YouTube version, although it's, again, just audio. But if you prefer YouTube, then we're on there. So don't forget to also give us a review. That would be lovely if you would be prepared to do that. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.